Artists find inspiration from all kinds of places. When Steven Spielberg was a kid and his parents got divorced, he created an imaginary friend to help deal with that situation. That imaginary friend was later the inspiration for E.T. And remember that movie The Cable Guy starring Jim Carrey?
Cable Guy!
The writer of that movie was a guy named Lou Holtz Jr., and he said that he was inspired to write it after just visiting his mother's apartment late at night, and he saw a cable guy in the hallway, and it just made him think, why is this guy here so late? And the story just came to him. And Wes Craven, the creator of Nightmare on Elm Street, was inspired by a series of articles he read in the Los Angeles newspapers in the early 80s. Stories of otherwise healthy, relatively young people just mysteriously dying in their sleep. Dozens of these cases kept popping up, and nobody knew why. The rumors around all these deaths were that these people were having similar nightmares involving a demon, and it was the demon that was killing them. That was obviously gossip and hearsay, but it did put an idea in his head. That of the ultimate horror villain. Somebody that attacks you when you're most vulnerable. When you're asleep. This was the inspiration for Freddy Krueger. The movie was a hit, and a cultural icon was born. But what was actually happening to these people? I took a deep dive into the articles and the research around this and found a story that's every bit as wild as any horror movie. It involves deep-seated cultural belief systems, geopolitical maneuvering, and war crimes. Lots of war crimes. This is the story of how Vietnam led to Elm Street. 1984 was a pretty wild year. Gandhi was assassinated, the first cases of the AIDS epidemic appeared, Apple launched its first Macintosh computer, and of course, Nightmare on Elm Street was released in theaters. November 9th, 1984 to be exact, meaning they released it after Halloween, which kind of feels like a missed opportunity. So if anybody's wondering why I didn't release this video before Halloween, I'm just being on brand. It showed in 380 theaters worldwide, but grossed a cool $25 million, which was enough to spawn a franchise and make Wes Craven a staple of the horror genre. By the way, fun fact, even though Elm Street is referenced in the title, it's never actually said in the movie. And the reason he went with Elm Street is actually a lot more interesting than you might think. In 2014, Rolling Stone did an interview with Wes Craven, Robert Englund, and actress Heather Langenkamp for the 30th anniversary, and Robert Englund quoted that line from the movie that, quote, every town has an Elm Street.
Every town has an Elm Street.
That's apparently what everybody asks him to write when he signs autographs and stuff, but Wes Craven corrected him, saying this, quote, Elm Street is the name of the street that ran past the book depository where Kennedy was shot. To me, it was where the innocent world ended. And ironically, it was Kennedy's death that may have put into motion the events that led to the creation of Freddy Krueger in the first place. Confused yet? Well, let's start by looking at those newspaper articles. In an interview with Cinema Fantastique in 2008, Wes Craven explained his inspiration as, quote, it was a series of articles in the LA Times, 3 small articles about men from Southeast Asia who were from immigrant families and who had died in the middle of nightmares. And the paper never correlated them, never said, hey, we've had another story like this. These were articles that he caught in the late 70s, but by early 1981, those newspapers started to actually see that connection. Stories circulated in Los Angeles, New York, Portland, and Minneapolis told of dozens of men from Laotian communities dying in their sleep. All men, all fairly young and healthy, all of them completely unexplained. The men were from a specific ethnic group from Laos called the Hmong people. In the late 70s and in 1980, waves of Hmong refugees immigrated to the United States, escaping the violence of the Civil War in their homeland. They settled mostly in California and in the Great Lakes region like Minnesota and Michigan. Their culture was deeply superstitious. They were often poor, lived in isolated mountain communities with little formal education, so belief in supernatural entities, demons and the like, wasn't uncommon. So when people began experiencing debilitating nightmares and then men started dying in their sleep with no rational explanation, yeah, rumors began to spread of demonic forces haunting their dreams and taking them at their most vulnerable. It's easy to see how Wes Craven would have been inspired by this. Researchers scrambled for an answer to this, some kind of commonality between them, which was hard. These cases were happening all over the place. And yes, they were all Hmong people, but Hmong people have been around for hundreds of years. This wasn't a known thing that happened. And without a known cause, they came up with a name for the condition, SUNS, which stands for Sudden Unexplained Nocturnal Death Syndrome. I'm sorry, I've got to do it.
Coming this Sunday to the Poughkeepsie Civic Center, Tokamak and Stellarator featuring Nocturnal Death Syndrome.
Bring the kids. You can think of it like SIDS, Sudden Infant Death Syndrome, but for adults. The victims showed no signs of heart attack or stroke, no shared pre-existing conditions. They just died. The wives of some of the victims would say that they would experience labored breathing in the middle of the night. I guess in some cases it was bad enough to wake up the wives, but they would notice that they would start to breathe heavily and then struggle to breathe and then stop breathing. They did often claim that these deaths were preceded by terrible nightmares that kept them from sleeping for days on end. In fact, Wes Craven, in an interview one time, described a case that he read about where a young man started having nightmares so bad that he took pills and drank coffee to stay awake for something like 6 days before he finally fell asleep and then died in his sleep. Now, I will say, I looked around, I wasn't able to find that story, so it's possible he was just, embellishing for the sake of promotion. Now, there have been a few hypotheses that have been explored to try to explain suns. The first one, and least likely in my opinion, is the supernatural explanation. Specifically, a demon called the Tsog. According to Hmong mythology, the Tsog was a nightmare spirit that would kill you in your sleep by crushing you to death. People who have survived the ordeal describe a moment when a sleeper becomes aware of a presence in the room, a feeling of impending evil. It's at this moment that they realize that they can't move. They're frozen in fear as the spirit appears in the corner of the room. They lie there helpless as it creeps over to them and climbs onto the bed, sitting on their chest and staring down at them as the weight makes them struggle to breathe. At this point, you wake up in a cold sweat, if you're lucky. The Tsog is thought to target people who have not adequately paid respect to their ancestors, which is a core practice in Hmong culture, and it targets men specifically. So, you can imagine that immigrant families that have moved away from the land of their ancestors may feel that they've disrespected them by moving away and thus be targeted by the Tsog. By the way, this idea of a sleep demon that sits on your chest and crushes you or prevents you from breathing, it's not unique to the Hmong people, not by a long shot. Interestingly, this is a very common phenomenon around the world. In Western culture, it's often called the night hag. In fact, the term nightmare was originally nightmare, a mare being a night hag in Scandinavian folklore. Now, if all of this sounds a lot like sleep paralysis to you, yeah, that's the leading explanation of this phenomenon. If you're lucky enough to have never experienced sleep paralysis, basically what happens is that when you fall asleep, your brain kind of paralyzes your body so that you can dream without, acting out what you're doing in your dream. It doesn't always work, as anybody who's ever been elbowed in the face by their spouse can tell you. But sometimes it can go the other way, causing you to be frozen and unable to move while in a half-awake, half-dream state. Meaning you feel like you're awake, but you can't move, and then, weird dream shit starts to happen around you. And if that dream turns out to be a nightmare, it can be a terrifying experience. So imagine you're from a culture that heavily believes in demonic spirits and that they'll attack you for not properly respecting your ancestors. And you're carrying around tons of guilt for leaving the homeland of those ancestors, and your brain is just pulsing with extreme PTSD from the war that forced you to go in the first place. You're in a strange place that maybe hasn't always made you exactly feel welcome, and there are dozens of stories of other people who have died from these spirits. And then, in the middle of the night, you wake up and realize you can't move. And you look over and you see something in the corner of the room. It might be enough to make you die of fright. The brain is a powerful thing. And the more people this happens to, the more fear and anxiety around it rises, which only makes it more likely to happen. It becomes kind of a social contagion, like the dancing plague. So while an actual demonic spirit murdering people is not very likely, belief in a demonic spirit murdering people is fairly plausible. But what if this explanation has it backwards? What if it's not the fear causing the heart problem, but a heart problem causing the fear? In other words, it's possible that they are actually experiencing an actual heart arrhythmia, and the pain and discomfort they're feeling manifests in a dream state as a demon sitting on their chest. This has led some to point the finger at a condition called Brugada Syndrome, or BRS. Brugada Syndrome is an inherited and thankfully rare cardiac disease that causes the heart to go into arrhythmia, meaning the chambers are not contracting in the right order and the heart fails to pump blood effectively. This is also known as an arrhythmogenic disease. People with Brugada Syndrome run an increased risk of ventricular fibrillation and sudden cardiac death. And some of the symptoms include fainting spells, seizures, and labored nocturnal breathing, which tracks. BRS was first described in 1992 by a research on 8 patients who were resuscitated from sudden cardiac death because of ventricular fibrillation. And approximately 11 to 28% of patients with BRS were found to be carriers of a genetic mutation, the majority of which were located on the SCN5A gene, which regulates the voltage-gated cardiac sodium channel. Now, this can be inherited, which might be an explanation because the Hmong originated from, isolated mountain communities. But if that's the case, there'd be evidence of this back in their homeland, which I wasn't really able to find in my research. Now, granted, Brugada is rare, and it's unlikely that widespread testing has been done to find it back in Laos, but again, it kind of goes back to the problem that suns seem to only affect Hmong immigrants, and if it was inherited, you'd probably see a lot of it back there too. Now, one explanation for that researchers have considered is epigenetic mutations. Epigenetics involves gene mutations caused by environmental factors, and there is some evidence to show that the SCN5A gene can be affected by extreme stress. Extreme stress, like, I don't know, maybe a civil war. Now, on the subject of the war, there is another war-related theory worth discussing. Now, I did say that before that none of the victims showed any signs of heart problems, but there have been some physiological anomalies that have sparked a few theories. So in the 80s, when all of this was going on, a doctor named Frederick Eckners looked at the hearts of some of the victims, and he found a commonality between all of them. They all had a frayed and twisted sinoatrial node. This matters because the sinoatrial node is a nerve that sends impulses to start the heartbeat. This has led some researchers to speculate that chemicals used during the war may be to blame. There is definitely precedence for this. You may have heard of Agent Orange, but in case you don't know what it was, Agent Orange was a defoliant, meaning it stripped the leaves off of trees. Vietnam being a jungle region, it made it easy for the Viet Cong to hide in the thick foliage, and it made it especially hard to see them from the air, so the US used defoliants to get rid of all that pesky leaf coverage. So Agent Orange could be considered chemical warfare, but it wasn't used directly on people. It wasn't like a nerve gas to kill people directly. It just, made it easier for the bullets to find them. But it did infamously affect people's nervous systems, including that of US soldiers, the consequences of which we've been dealing with for decades. That also includes birth defects, which, if you're running low on nightmare fuel, feel free to Google Agent Orange birth defects. I will not be showing that here. And while Agent Orange hasn't been connected to this specific issue of the sinoatrial node, it wasn't the only chemical that was used and dumped on the jungles of Vietnam and the surrounding countries. Not to mention, with war comes lots of fire. Fires release all kinds of chemicals into the air, and it gets breathed in, does all kinds of damage, some of which takes years to manifest. Now, the counter-argument to this is that such a chemical wouldn't have this kind of effects after so much time has gone by since exposure. Just recently, the U.S. government admitted that burn pits in the Iraq War led to massive upticks in cancers for service members. But in the end, it might be a combination of all these things. Chemical exposure, cultural beliefs, genetic abnormalities combined with overwhelming PTSD. And I brought out the PTSD thing several times, kind of ambiguously without getting into specifics, so, you might be wondering what it was about their situation that was so traumatic. Obviously war is traumatic, and being a refugee on top of that even more so, but the plight of the Hmong people is especially brutal. Here in the US, we're deeply familiar with the Vietnam War. It defined an entire era of the 20th century and left divisions and scars that we're still working to heal. But the violence of the Vietnam War didn't happen here, in our backyards. It happened there, in their backyards. And it wasn't just in Vietnam. What we think of as the Vietnam War was really a regional conflict that spread across several countries, including Cambodia and Laos, and spawned brutal civil wars in both of those countries. The killing fields of Cambodia and the reign of terror of the Khmer Rouge have been well documented, but what happened in Laos has kind of been missed by a lot of us. First of all, the US needed to shut down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This was a supply line that fed weapons and people to the Viet Cong, and it ran through Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. The easiest way to do this was to bomb from the air. So they did. A lot. Laos especially. It was a mountainous region covered by forests, and the US already was embroiled in a ground war in Vietnam. They didn't want to risk more casualties by doing the same thing in an even more inhospitable area, so yeah, bombing became the tactic. Starting in 1964, the US began flying covert bombing missions out of Thailand under the codename Operation Barrel Roll. Hundreds of AC-130s and B-52s filled with cluster bombs and other ordnance would eventually drop over 2 million tons of bombs between 1964 and 1973. That comes out to an estimated 260 million bombs. Or, to put this another way, it's an equivalent of a plane load of bombs being dropped on the country every 8 minutes, 24 hours a day, for 9 years. In fact, Laos holds the record for the most bombed country in human history. And by the way, many of those bombs didn't explode on impact. They would only explode years later, so the people of Laos have been dealing with that problem ever since. Something like 20,000 Laotians have been killed or injured by unexploded ordnance over the years. But just to add to that horror for the Hmong people, when the communist Pathet Lao group began the rise in power in Laos, the CIA recruited and trained Hmong soldiers to fight and repel the communist forces. This led to the aforementioned Laos Civil War. The communist forces would eventually prevail in Laos, which led to a brutal wave of reprisals against the Hmong for having worked with the US. Hmong families were hunted down and massacred in what many have called a genocide. By 1976, 10% of the population of Laos was dead. Double that was wounded or injured, and a full quarter of the country had become refugees, hundreds of thousands of which made their way to the US, which is where our story began. It's hard to say how history would have changed if Kennedy had not been assassinated, but many speculate that our involvement in Vietnam would have been severely reduced or delayed at the very least. According to many sources, he was unwilling to fully commit to the war in Vietnam. In fact, he ordered a small troop withdrawal just a month before he was killed. On Elm Street. So while we may never fully know what caused the condition that inspired Wes Craven, it's easy to see how the trauma of the Hmong immigrants may have played a major role. And everything I just talked about is just merely scratches the surface of the atrocities in Laos. I couldn't possibly talk about it all here, so I made a totally separate video for it. It's part of my Forgotten Atrocities series, and you can watch it over on Nebula. In it, I go into detail about Operation Momentum, which was the CIA's covert operation involving the Hmong people. I talk about Henry Kissinger's role in the program and how it went sideways, and the brutal aftermath that followed. I purposely left a lot of that out of this video for YouTube reasons, but I also wanted to keep this about the mystery illness story. But these two do go hand in hand. Here's a quick clip. Yeah, it's estimated that by 1973, the Hmong had suffered 18,000 to 20,000 soldiers killed in action, with an additional civilian Hmong death toll nearing 50,000. So the Hmong, a mountain-dwelling group that mostly kept to themselves, were now brought into this flashpoint of this global Cold War, and then left to their own defenses under the leadership of General Vang Pao. Nebula, of course, is where you can find my original series, Mysteries of the Human Body, where I look at everything from unexplained plagues to human oddities to diseases we still can't cure. All with a little bit of humor. It's not all that dark. And there's actually a ton of original series on Nebula that you can't find anywhere else. It's a platform that's owned and run by thoughtful creators as a place to make projects we really care about without having to play to the whims of the YouTube algorithm. I highly recommend Real Science's Becoming Human series that talks about the evolution of humans from primates in the trees to the world-altering species that we are today. Or something a bit more in line with today's topic, you've got Real Life Lore's Modern Conflict series that explains and takes a deep dive into the conflicts making headlines today, like the Israel-Hamas war and the Lebanese Civil War. And that list is growing all the time, and pretty much anything you're interested in, you can find it there. And we're even starting to get into feature film projects, which, I have my sights on. You can also see all my videos early and ad-free. It's a great way to support the channel, but more importantly, if you like what I do, you'll find tons of great stuff you'll love there. And if you sign up for Nebula at my link down below, you can get an annual subscription for 40% off. That comes out to like $250 a month. It's a bonkers deal. So go check it out. It's nebula.tv/Joe Scott, or just click the link down in the description. Now, thanks so much for watching, and a big shout out to the Answer Files on Patreon and the channel members that are supporting this channel, helping keep the lights on and forming a really awesome community. I cannot thank you guys enough. I got some new people I need to shout out real quick. We got Bill Nentel, Carolyn, Grumpy and Stitch, Mary, Frank, Stephanie McClure, Tavulin Dark, Devin Hutton, Ricardo Gill, Bo, and Ashley Johnson. Thank you guys so much. If you would like to join them and get early access to videos, access to exclusive live streams, and just access to those cool people, just go to patreon.com/answerswithjoe. Please do like and share this video if you liked it, and if this is your first time here, I will link right here to a video on the Ebola cyclone, which was another Southeast Asia disaster that led to really awful political stuff as well. Or you can just check out any of the thumbnails that you see on the side if you're on your browser. Any of them that you like, take a look at them. I invite you to subscribe if you're not already subscribed. I come back with videos every Monday. And I think that's it for now. You guys go out there, have an eye-opening rest of the week. Stay safe, and I'll see you next Monday. Love you guys. Take care.